Hi, I have pulled out the autistic t-shirt, which you can't really see, right? See, it says autistic. So we all know what that means. Today, April 2nd, is Autism Awareness and Acceptance Day, a day which we should all wear red, and you are required to both be aware and accepting of me. So you should go work on that. Today we're going to celebrate it by talking about the neurodivergency movement, where it came from, what it's doing, common criticisms of the movement, and not just from the outside. We have a little bit of infighting and some other issues that are important to recognize, and then some information on how you can celebrate Autism Awareness and Acceptance Month and, in general, be a good ally. I'm excited. I hope that you're excited. Let us get into it. So, as we talked about in my disability rights history video, which I will link above, the disability rights movement gained traction with all of the other major civil rights movements in the 60s and the 70s. And while autism and other general neurodevelopmental disorders were kind of included in that movement, they didn't separate into their own category, at least as an advocacy movement, until significantly later. The Autism Society of America was founded in 1965 and hosted the first Autism Awareness Month in 1970, but that was founded by the dude who created ABA therapy, so there's kind of dual movements here. We're going to talk about this in a bit, but one is kind of with the medical model of disability, and the other one's with the social model. Now, in 1992, we saw the foundation of the Autism Network International, made by and for autistic people. And in 93, at the International Conference on Autism in Toronto, one of the founders, Jim Sinclair, gave a speech titled "Don't Mourn for Us," which was about how autism is not a curse or a loss of a child or anything bad, it just simply is. In 1998, a sociologist named Judy Singer coined the term neurodiversity to describe people with a wide array of neurological experiences such as Tourette's, schizophrenia, depression, dyslexia, migraines, synesthesia, autism, ADHD, DID, epilepsy, and so many more things. There's so many things in the neurodivergency category, and some people are starting to include transness in that, which I also agree because we know that there's brain differences. And overall, this idea emphasizes that many of these experiences cannot be clearly delineated from each other because they all tend to be kind of intertwined and every single one of them is different. The neurodiversity paradigm, meaning a model of neurodivergency, was created by Nick Walker in 2014, and I will link the article below for you. It is a specific perspective on neurodivergency that has three fundamental principles. First, neurodiversity is a natural and valuable form of human diversity. Second, the idea that there is one normal or healthy type of brain or mind, or one right style of neurocognitive functioning, is a culturally constructed fiction, no more valid and no more conducive to a healthy society or to the overall well-being of humanity than the idea that there is one normal or right ethnicity, gender, or culture. And third, the social dynamics that manifest in regard to neurodiversity are similar to the social dynamics that manifest in regard to other forms of human diversity. For example, diversity of ethnicity, gender, or culture. These dynamics include the dynamics of social power inequalities and also the dynamics by which diversity, when embraced, acts as a source of creative potential. And then World Autism Awareness Day, which is April 2nd, was voted on by the UN General Assembly in 2007 with the first celebration observance in 2008. Obviously, this holiday has been completely co-opted by Autism Speaks that heavily capitalizes on it in a very gross manner. But if you ignore that whole bit of it and the autism positive movement version of it, it's pretty exciting. And what I find interesting with the neurodivergency movement is, as I said earlier, there are kind of two parallel movements. We have the medical raise awareness for a cure movement run by the parents of autistic kids and psychologists, and then we have the social self-advocacy autism is natural human variation movement run by and for autistic people and allies. And that movement is slowly overtaking the medical model movement. Slowly. But the most interesting thing to me is the timeline of these movements. The self-advocacy movement is actually directly correlated with the rise of internet usage. When the internet was created and became more widespread, we've seen a correlational increase in self-advocacy because people are finding each other online, which logically does make sense because if you think of the stereotype of an autistic person, they rarely go out and spend time with their friends and prefer to stay on the computer all the time. And this theory as to why we saw this movement take off in the late 90s, early 2000s in comparison with data of internet usage has been around since back then. So it's been really cool to notice that there's this second huge expansion of the autistic and neurodivergency rights and self-advocacy movements that has happened because of the pandemic, which is a time when so many people turned back to an online presence in order to cope with loss of in-person sociability. So super cool to see how that happens. But anyway, so let's talk about the major criticisms of this movement and how we as advocates, allies, and people in the community can be aware of them. The first one is that some people criticize the neurodiversity movement for romanticizing differences and those who have superpowers and ignoring those who are not higher functioning, and ignoring the suffering and the struggles involved in living with one of these disabilities. There's also been some accusations of the movement being anti-treatment and anti-cure. And on one level, I do see where these ideas came from. I mean, if you've only seen the medical model of disability and then suddenly handed the social model, it does feel a little bit like it's ignoring the actual hard parts of being disabled, especially with the whole autism is a superpower movement and the we are superhuman stuff that's, I want to say that happened in the past, but it's still kind of happening. And I get it, I see it, we've talked about this before, but when you're actually in the community, we're usually like, hey, you don't deserve to suffer because of your disability, how can we support you? At the same time as being like, you don't need to be ashamed of or hide your disability because disability isn't a bad word. And both of those things can be true and can both coexist in the same space. The next criticism is the exclusionary aspect of the movement. And if you've been watching my channel or just like existed in the neurodiversity/autism space online, even for a few weeks probably, you may notice a trend in language usage. People tend to use the word neurodivergency as a catch-all for autism and maybe a sprinkle of ADHD. And we've all seen posts that are like, neurodivergent traits that are literally just lists of autistic traits. Do you really think it's possible that somebody with depression or an autistic person or dyspraxic and a brain trauma survivor can all have the same traits? Because that's not how that one works. And I'm going to be fully and totally honest that I also catch myself saying neurodivergent to solely mean autistic and or ADHD. Like 100%, I've done it before, I will probably do it again. And I'm very sure that I've done it in several of my videos by accident, but what's important to note here is that neurodivergency is not a monolith experience, and it's not another euphemism to say autism and ADHD. It's a vast and varied community, in the same way that the term people of color would be really illogical to use if you're only talking about Asian people, because that's excluding a huge part of the demographic that fits within that term. And also, obviously, every single race has a very different experience than another one. And sure, they may all understand the shared trauma of being discriminated against because of the color of their skin, but that discrimination is very different between subgroups and is all for different reasons, even if it looks the same. Now, speaking of race and privilege, specifically in the autism section of the neurodivergency movement, you may notice something. The majority of the autistic advocates that we see are white. And I would love to go, why is that? But I think since we all live in a society, we probably fully know why that is, so we don't really need to cover that. And it doesn't have to be that way, but it is. And as we were talking about with there not being one neurodivergent experience, there's also not one autistic experience, because obviously it's a spectrum. And as we're seeing a rise in advocacy, which is super, super great, we often see that the common autistic experience being shared is that of late diagnosed white, medium to low support needs autistics. And I say that fully knowing that I am completely in that category, hence why I've always tried my hardest to read like a million sources for every video to try and fill in the other experiences that I don't have, but I know that what I'm doing is not anywhere near perfect. Another common discussion is the representation, or lack thereof, of non-speaking and nonverbal autistics and those with high support needs within the movement. And there are two sides to this discussion. The first is that the conversation is kind of dominated by people with lower support needs, specifically the push that autism and other neurodivergencies aren't disabilities. There is so much privilege in being able to say that, and that very much needs to be acknowledged way more often than it is. And the second is the idea that the autism movement doesn't include non-speaking people and those with high support needs is often used as more of a dismissal of our movement and an insult to the community, specifically by parents of autistic kids who dismiss our movement, saying that we're not like their child because, well, we can communicate for ourselves, and that the things that we are talking about and our experiences don't apply to their loved one because we are higher functioning. What they don't realize is that autistic people, regardless of support needs, can and should advocate for themselves because, well, communication, whether that's verbally or through some form of AAC, is a human right that a lot of parents and caregivers still deny to those in their care, and this is a serious human rights issue, which, in my opinion, makes no sense because, of course, somebody is going to be very hard to work with and take care of and support if they don't have any ability to communicate with you. They're going to be frustrated and overwhelmed and screaming and all over the place all the time. And by saying, my kid isn't like you and never will be, you're showing that you've kind of lost hope in them, which is really unfortunate, especially because, you keep flooding the inboxes of autism advocates saying how every doctor and therapist has led you astray and you're so tired and you want to help your kid. And then we basically say, hey, here's how to facilitate communication so that they can advocate for themselves. And then you completely shut us down because you didn't want to hear that. It's really annoying, it's really frustrating, and it's very taxing on us. Also, when it comes to the idea of support needs, it's typically not talking about the level of support that the individual needs. It's usually talking about the supports that the families need. And yes, that is super important, and you all deserve to have more support in order to work well with a loved one and facilitate communication and deal with the behaviors that are causing serious issues in your home life and all of those other things. And that's all super, super valid. But conflating what the individual needs with what everybody else around them wants or thinks that they need, not the vibe. Which I guess brings us back to the point of, if you give us access to communication, things kind of get easier for everybody involved. But it's also important to realize that communication is also a process. People often look at an online advocate who may talk about their experiences of using AAC to communicate and then saying, well, they're a unicorn and they're extra special and extra smart. My kid can never do that, without realizing that this advocate spent years and years of very hard work to get to where they are today. Well, you haven't even given them communication, so you're nowhere near that point yet. So just be patient. And the last part of this is that a very high percentage of autistic people that you see online do have high support needs. There is a reason that our movement is rather written text based and online. I mean, I'm considered to be medium to low support needs depending on the day. Very much depends on the environment. Support needs so much fluctuate, but I lose my ability to speak semi-frequently to frequently depending on my situation. And you just don't know that because I obviously don't film on those days. Those are the days that I do my research, my writing, and my editing. And online advocacy gives me the space and the time to be an advocate, regardless of what my support needs may be on a given day. And people with higher daily support needs are also a vital part of the neurodivergency movement, not a separate entity. They're not only crucial to our movement, but the creators of it. Because remember that those people who talk loudly about the autistic experience, who are late diagnosed, I wouldn't have gotten a diagnosis 20, even 10 years ago. And while we may talk the loudest, the movement that we're a part of wouldn't exist without those who were diagnosed 50 years ago. And that does not mean that the earlier point about autistic representation being mostly lower support needs individuals who talk maybe a little bit too loud over everyone else is not true, because it is, and for sure we have things to work on within the movement and within the community. But it's also important to acknowledge that in a lot of cases, the majority of the community doesn't want us talking as loudly all the time. In comparison, we try to uplift all those other voices, and those other voices are out there and they're talking, and you just don't realize it because you don't believe that people with higher support needs are capable of that. So it's more of your own ableism going into the situation than lack of representation. So all in all, as with any other movement, the neurodiversity and autism movements have their issues, but that is obviously quite normal, especially in a movement that is so comparatively young compared to many other civil rights movements that we're still struggling with and discussing today. I'm looking at you, racism and sexism. Now, speaking of today, it's Autism Awareness Day. So how can you support us this month? And also, always, because autism is not just a month long, it's kind of like a lifelong thing. The first thing is to follow, uplift, and amplify autistic voices. We are the only ones who can truly speak on what it's like to be autistic, so we should be the only ones speaking about it. And I will include a resource guide as well as a Spotify playlist that I made of all autistic musicians in the description for you, so you can hear more of our voices. You can also be a great ally by not supporting Autism Speaks and instead supporting autistic-led organizations, as well as hiring us for jobs, please, changing your language to stop using ableist slurs and euphemisms, and working on generally being accepting, patient, and as accessible as possible. And also stop consuming and sharing inspiration porn, because that's really gross and we don't need any more of that. And if you don't know what any of the things I just said meant or how to do that, I will link videos about every single one of them in the description for you to help you out on your journey, your exploration, because I know a lot of people on my channel are going to be new this month. So hi, welcome. I also have some resource guides for you as well. And if you want to stick around, if you're new here, I'm quite happy to have you in my little corner of the internet. You are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe, and all of those other things. I have I have a bunch of really cool, exciting videos coming up this month, so I'm really excited. And to all of my autistic friends, please spend some time today doing some self-care because you deserve it. I wish you all a lovely day. I wish every allistic person a lovely day. And as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, your story isn't over. It has only just begun. And I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.